Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Kasia Berbari, and I'm managing the surveys portfolio at the International Air Transport Association. Thank you all for joining. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this IATA webinar, The Voice of the Customer, which is setting the stage for the whole series of webinars under the umbrella Reshaping the Passenger Experience. So today, more than ever, the customer voice is at the core of what we do. Understanding true passenger behaviors and the passenger preferences will be the key in shaping the proper measures for the industry restart. While we collect different kinds of data, it will be also very important to know how to shape the future, and all those insights will help us to guide the passenger journey of tomorrow. So please join me in welcoming today's speakers of the session. So we'll be joined by David Rockland, CEO and partner of Rockland and Dutton Research and Consulting, who will be sharing with us the passenger preferences and needs amidst COVID-19 that comes from the IATA commissioned study. We will have also William Mitchell, who is heading the customer insights activities at American Airlines. And he will tell us how at their airline they have adjusted their whole passenger surveys program to this new reality. We'll have also Andrew Matters, who is the Chief Deputy Economist at IATA, and he will tell us something about the macro outlook on the market and some of the future perspectives for the couple of months. And myself, Kasia Berbari, I'm gonna try to give you and draw for you the landscape of the passenger experience before it all began. As I mentioned at the very beginning, there will be the Q&A session at the very end of the presentations. So we kindly encourage you to stay until the very end to be able to listen to the interesting discussion of our panelists. And as mentioned, also you have a chat window in your view, so you'll be able to start asking the questions throughout all the presentations. And I would like to also highlight that this session, as all IATA meetings, will be complying to the laws of antitrust and the competition. So I would also the whole session will be overviewed by our legal advisor, and we also ask you to respect those rules when asking the questions. So without further ado, let us begin. So in order to understand the actual passenger preferences during the COVID-19, it's also very important to take a step back and have a look how this whole landscape of the passenger experience looked like before it all started. So for the sake of the analysis, we're going to use data that come from our passenger satisfaction benchmark, Airsat, where we survey on an ongoing basis around 75,000 passengers on an annual basis. We do approach passengers in a very random basis. So all the people who take part in this survey are recruited in a very random aspect, and also they are recruited at 40 global airports with the highest traffic numbers. So that's why, thanks to this approach, we are able to collect feedback from very different groups of passengers. So we're going to have people who are just the seasonal travelers who travel just once or twice a year. We're going to have all types of leisure travelers, those also who travel to visit the family or friends, up until the very frequent flyers and the business travelers as well. And when we look at the whole trend of the passenger satisfaction, we track the passenger satisfaction since 2010. So we have a good history of the data. We know how the data look like across the whole period. And it's also interesting to see and rewarding for us as the industry that the whole passenger satisfaction was growing across the years. So as an industry and all the stakeholders that contributed to this success, it's a very good sign, because we managed to elevate the passenger experience in a long term. However, when thinking about the about the passenger experience and such big sets of data, it's also important to understand what is the pain point, what is the actual need of the passenger, especially today, especially in this very critical period where everything seemed to be disturbed. And I will quote here Bill Gates, who says that your most unhappy customers are your greatest source of learning. And it's all about it, identifying the pain points, identifying the most needs of the passengers. And what we do with our program is that when we collect different types of data, we also try to identify what areas of the passenger experience contribute to passenger satisfaction and dissatisfaction. This is our key driver analysis that we use. I'm not going to go into too much details of this analysis because we could spend a lot of time on that. But just to give you a high-level overview, let's assume you bought a car, brand new car, and the next day you have an important meeting at work in the very morning. You go to your garage and the car doesn't start. The engine doesn't work. What you're gonna feel? You're gonna feel frustrated. You're gonna feel horrible, and this small incident from the morning will destroy your entire day. On the other hand, if the car starts, you're not gonna praise your car manufacturer for the fact that your car started, right? You assume that this is the must-have, something that you wouldn't even think about if something doesn't go wrong. So that's why we call such aspects must-haves. They will, if something goes wrong, they will definitely make you unhappy. You will be dissatisfied. It will destroy your experience. But on the other hand, if everything goes wrong, it's not gonna boost your satisfaction. Now let's think about the acceleration. So if your car drives fast, you will be happy, you will be satisfied. It goes well, everything is good. If it doesn't, on the other hand, it will go in another direction. It will drive your dissatisfaction. So that's why those types of attributes that drive our perception in two directions, we're gonna call them key. And then at the very end, we have the value add attributes. So let's assume leather seats. If you have them, definitely they will boost your satisfaction. It will feel good. But if they are not there, most probably you're not going to complain too much. Of course, it depends on the type of the passenger, type of the driver, after all, right? And what's very important also in this whole picture is that you will enjoy the leather seats only if your acceleration works well, but most of all, if your engine actually starts. So right now, I would like to go back to air travel experience. And see what do you think? From your perspective, what is the most important attribute that drives for you the passenger experience? In a way, what would be your must-have? What if this part of the passenger journey goes wrong, it will destroy your entire travel experience. We would like to see what do you think? So we see the votes coming. Thank you so much. And we're going to give you a couple of seconds to gather more views from more of you, just to have better understanding. Okay, so let's give you last 10 seconds to decide, and we will close the poll, because I see we have already a good representation of our audience. Okay, thank you so much. So, and can we display the results, how it looks like? So is it surprising or not for all of you? For me, it's actually not surprising, because actually this is also what our analysis is telling us. However, you will see some different also aspects in the data that I'm going to show you later. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. And now we will come back to our presentation. I would like to share with us, with you, the actual data that we get from the population of the travelers that we are surveying. Of course, it's a bigger sample, as mentioned, more random customers, different also a profile, more varied. That's why the results are different and more representative at the end. So as you can see, in the economy class cabin, we have as must-haves boarding, cabin crew, and post-flight experience, which are basically those aspects that if something goes wrong in those areas, it may destroy the entire experience that is there. The key attribute and the key area that we are talking about for the economy class passengers is the cabin. We are talking here about the spaciousness, about the temperature, and the design of the cabin, etc. So apparently this is something as the second priority for those passengers. And also we have a lot of attributes from the food and beverages area that comes there. And the clear value add seems to be the in-flight entertainment and the seat, which is basically something like a cherry on the cake. It's also very interesting to see how the perception and the priorities differ when we look at the business cabin. Because we know that the product and service offering for those two cabins is different, and we see that must-haves, cabin crew, and overall post-flight experience, this is something that is the must. Actually, in general, the cabin crew, this is where the whole experience is very, very important for all the passengers. In the key area, in business cabin, we see that there is the accumulation of many aspects, right? So in the economy, it was a completely different distribution. Here, the key, we have a big accumulation. And the only value add that remains is the majority of the in-flight entertainment. So with this, I would like to basically drive this discussion into the direction that this is how the experience looked like before the pandemic started. Right now, with the new measures, new standards, new procedures implemented throughout the entire passenger experience, we may expect that all those measures will have higher or lower impact on different steps of the passenger journey. We are talking about passenger declarations, the screening, wearing masks, disinfection, or the whole physical distancing aspect. They will be impacting the journey. There will be some steps that will be implemented either short term or will become a new normal. But for sure, this is something that is going to impact the passenger experience. When we look at the detailed attributes, what's also very interesting, for example, the professional appearance of the cabin crew. It may get a completely new meaning if the crew is going to start the personal protection equipment, such as masks or even the gloves. Another topic is food and beverages, right? Some of the carriers have resigned completely from offering. The other have reduced significantly the whole food and beverages listings. It may be the short term, right? But we know that it will impact also in a bit longer term the whole passenger experience. And lastly, what would be very interesting to see is the aspect of cleanliness, right? So when we are talking about the disinfection with relation to the COVID-19, it's also very interesting how this cleanliness aspect that we see right now popping in the value add attributes or the key aspects, maybe it will move to the new must-haves. And this, just to close my presentation, at the end, it's all going to be about restoring the confidence in flying, establishing trust, providing feeling of safety, and bringing the confidence in passengers that they can fly again. So with this message, I would like to thank you so much for this first part of the speech. And I'm gonna now hand over to David Rockland from Rockland and Dutton Research and Consulting, who will be presenting to us the results of the survey, IATA Commission survey, where we are exploring the passenger needs and specific behaviors that we may expect in the times of the pandemic. So David, thank you so much, and over to you.
Great, Cassia, thank you. And it's a pleasure to join everybody here from our farm, which is on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. If you don't know this part of the world very well, we're about 70 miles east of Washington. And our little firm, Rockland Dutton, is based out of our farm. Just to give you a second of background, the Dutton part is actually my wife, and she was the head of polling for CBS News, retired from there, used to run the CBS New York Times poll. I used to run a very large research company in the communications business called Ketchum, and I've had the pleasure of working with IATA, I guess since 2014, when I was on a panel moderated by Richard Quest in Doha, along with Alexandra Dejuniak, talking about corporate reputation in the airline industry. And so that's a little bit of background. Let me tell you what we're talking about today, which is that we have run 3 waves of research about the effect of COVID-19 on airline travelers. We've surveyed in 11 countries. Actually, Chile was added in April. So initially it was 10, now it's 11. It's a 50-50 split between business and leisure travelers, where you identify those in terms of what they say they do the most. And again, these waves have run about every 7 weeks, and we're trying to see how has this issue continued to evolve over time. In terms about, oops, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. Well, in terms about issue 1 is just concern around contracting the virus. One of the things we have seen is that it has gone up from February to April, but then dropped off a bit here in June. The greatest increase between February and April was among those who were very concerned, and that same number, the very concerned number, has declined between April and June. Despite that decline, the numbers are very, very high, as you can see here. Although it's also, I think, interesting to look at where this decline in concern about contracting the virus has taken place. And as you can see here in this chart, the three biggest drops have taken place in Canada, in France, and here in the USA. And honestly, I'm kind of surprised, speaking as someone from the USA, given that we have over 100,000 deaths from COVID-19, the highest in the world, yet we've seen concern here drop. One of the other questions we asked, just to sort of set the stage for this survey, is do you know someone, or have you or a family member been infected? And you see a fairly wide diversity in terms of responses by country. Overall, about 45% say yes, I or someone I know have, versus 55 saying no. But that number is very variable across the countries. And it also has increased dramatically in a couple of cases, particularly the UAE and Chile, where you've seen a 27% jump in the UAE in the last 2 months, 28% there in Chile. And it's interesting, as you look at the lower numbers, Japan has seen very little in terms of knowing somebody who might be infected. And we'll come back to these numbers here in a few minutes when we talk about how long people will be waiting to travel, and is it related to, in any way, knowing someone who might have been infected. People have been taking a lot of steps to avoid contracting COVID-19. When we first asked this question, again in February, it was interesting to see that 16% of the total sample across the countries said, no, I haven't done anything. That number has dropped now to 2%. And as we look ahead and you say, okay, once the pandemic subsides, what are you going to continue to do? Will you continue to take steps? And 96% say they're going to take some step in one way or another. Obviously, washing hands has increased dramatically, so has avoided being in large meetings. But as we then look going forward, we see a lot of those numbers tend to remain. And probably the most important one here for this audience is, at this point, we see 58% of our sample saying, I have avoided air travel. In terms of anticipating doing that in the future, and this is a little concerning, that number is still a third at 33%. So even though once the pandemic subsides, there is going to be, at least based on this survey, some sense of a lingering effect from the pandemic and a lingering level of concern. But what are people concerned about? And we asked about 12 different items of concern for the airport, 11 in terms of the aircraft. And we first asked, how concerned do you find this or that or the next thing? Are you extremely concerned, somewhat concerned, etc.? And what we find for everything you ask about, doesn't matter what it is, in terms of extremely and somewhat concerned, you get very high numbers. The lowest number, for example, at the airport is 60% for baggage. The lowest number for the plane is 55% concerned in terms of interactions with the crew. And from there, it grows into the 80s for all these items. So in the survey, we then ask, okay, of the things that you have listed as extremely or somewhat concerning, pick your top three. And what you see here at the airport is it's around being on a crowded bus or train, it's standing in line, it's around the toilets. On the plane, it's also around the toilets. It's also, however, and the very most, about sitting next to somebody who might be infected. But still, in terms of top three, breathing the air in the plane is one of the top three concerns. If we look and say, okay, so how long is this going to last? When do people expect to return to travel as usual once the pandemic has subsided? And if you add the top two bars here in June, you find that 45% say, I'll be returning to how I traveled as usual within the next couple months, somewhere from no wait at all to up to 2 months. But that number of 45% has dropped from 61% in April, which is basically saying we could expect, at least based on this survey, somewhat of a longer delay. One thing I should point out is when we asked this in April, we did have a caveat, and the caveat that the pandemic had been declared, or travel had been declared safe by an authority you trust, and the most trusted authorities are your own doctor and the WHO. But nonetheless, what's concerning here, and I would at least be cognizant of, is an expectation that there will be some delay in terms of returning to normality. If a vaccine appeared right now, would everything go back to normal immediately? No, it wouldn't. In terms of where that is relatively more true, less true, who's going to return quickest, in terms of responses by country, you see France and Germany and the UAE as the ones, Chile as well, in terms of within a month or two returning to normal in terms of having the highest numbers. Interestingly, the countries with the longest delay in returning would be Japan and Singapore based on this survey. And again, if you recall a moment ago, I showed you levels of infection, knowing people who have been infected or you yourself were lowest in Japan and Singapore. And almost what you would expect is where you have low infection, you would be likely to return quicker. That's really not true for Japan and Singapore. Flip side, if you recall, the UAE had the highest number in terms of knowing people, yet they have the highest number in terms of quickness to return to travel. So there are some cultural differences, some trust differences, some behavioral differences that are certainly country specific. What's going to make things better? What's going to make passengers feel safe? And so the first thing is knowing more. We asked about 9 different items in terms of knowing things you'd like to know about that would make you feel safer. The top 3 are shown here. They involve testing passengers before they come in the airport, to go into the airport and on the aircraft, and people are wearing protective gear, and then also that planes and airports are sanitized. So knowledge is important, and it was interesting that no matter the thing we asked about, of those 9 about knowledge, any of them test fine. The more you know, the safer you feel. And then in terms of how should an airline communicate, it's really through the ways that the airlines are already communicating. We offered respondents up to 3 choices: emails, online check-in. The way you often hear from your carrier are the ways that resonate the most among the top 3. In terms of specific safety measures, these are all the ones. In the previous slide, I just showed you the top 3 or 4, but I thought it'd be helpful to show you everything here. And again, we asked the question, what would make you feel a lot or somewhat safer? Basically, everyone picks everything. And so then we ask, okay, of the ones that would make you feel a lot or somewhat safer, what are your top 3? And what you're seeing here sort of goes along with the knowledge one just a moment ago, but they generally have to do around knowing other people, have been screened, wearing masks, social distancing on the aircraft. One of the things we looked at is, do people differentiate between temperature testing at departure versus screening for COVID-19 at departure? And obviously you can see here between the top bar and the 5th one down is that there is a difference of about 11 points as a top 3 choice. So people do see those 2 things as somewhat different. Our final question to show you here today is, we then asked, okay, so what are you willing to do, personally willing to do, when travel resumes? What will you do? And sort of on the downside is, this was a list of 15 different items. You could pick all the ones that you wanted, all that applied, and pick them all if you wanted. And these are the top 6. And what we found is that in no case among those 15 items did more than roughly 4 in 10 respondents say, yes, I'm willing to do that. That's the negative. On the positive side, only 3% said, I won't do anything at all. So there is some level of willingness on the part of passengers to take action themselves and to participate, if you will, in their own safety, the safety of passengers around them. But I would argue that has a little ways to go. So that is try to advance the slide here, quick summary. And let me flip it now back to you, Kasia, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share this data with you.
Thank you very much, David, for this presentation. And for all those of you who would be interested to learn more about the insights, more detail, because as you saw here, we just presented the highlights of it, and try to understand differences for business or leisure travelers for different countries. We encourage you to visit our website, where in a couple of days the actual report, full report, will be available. So now I would like to hand it over to William from American Airlines, who's going to be talking about how he and his team adjusted the whole customer experience program to this new reality. So William, thank you so much, and over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Kasia, and thank you to everyone for joining. And I appreciate the time that you have taken today. So my name is William. I am with American Airlines. I have been working in research for about 3 decades. I've been with American for about 20 years. And this is, as they say in the United States, this is not my first rodeo with a crisis. But I will tell you, I've never in my entire career seen anything quite like the COVID-19 crisis. And that's coming from a guy who worked the 9/11 crisis and the recession of 2008 and a couple of other pretty serious instances. So what I'm going to walk you through this morning and or this afternoon and this evening, depending on where you are, is a description of how we at American gathered customer insights and tried to provide information to our executives and our operational people to help them not only make decisions, but also to help them understand the psyche of our customers and their mindset, and understand what their fears and concerns were, because obviously with a pandemic like this, particularly one like COVID-19, where so little was known in the early days, we felt it was very important to understand just how people were feeling about the crisis. And as I also indicated, the second thing is we wanted to make sure that we were taking the right measures to deal with the pandemic. Just as a footnote, our approach at American was as follows. We believe this to be obviously a global crisis, a shared crisis, and our thought with regard to COVID-19 was that we needed to do whatever was possible in terms of a travel industry response to this crisis, and do what was best for our customers in terms of their safety, their well-being, and in terms of their health. Likewise, we had a similar concern for our team members, particularly those on the front lines, our crew members, those who work at the airport, and also our partners at the airport who run concessions and restaurants. So with that, let me walk you through at least some background with respect to the studies that we did. First of all, when the pandemic first revealed itself several months ago, we took the time to sort of pick up some learnings from prior crises, 9/11 and the 08 recession, which I mentioned. Let me talk a little bit about 9/11. Most of you in the industry understand that COVID-19 has some similarities to 9/11, but at least in terms of the capacity that we pulled down, 9/11 pales in comparison to what we did with COVID-19. After 9/11, we reduced our schedule for a few weeks by about 30% and spent a couple of years building it back up. With COVID-19, we reduced our schedule from anywhere to 70 to 80%. So a much more significant schedule reduction from an airline standpoint, and at least in our case, a much more significant reduction overseas outside of the US versus what we flew domestically. So a very challenging pandemic, different in some ways than 9/11. We looked at 9/11 and the 08 recession, not only to understand passenger reaction, but also sort of looking at the comeback trail. And as most of you who lived through 9/11, that comeback was about a 2 to 3 year cycle. And so that became sort of our benchmark in understanding how long we thought we would be down with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. Secondly, we spent a lot of time benchmarking with other carriers and IATA. In fact, I spent some time talking to Kasia and others at IATA and Airsat to understand whether it was even appropriate to gather insights from customers via surveys. I know that may sound strange, but our concern was, given the seriousness of this disease, we wanted to make sure it was appropriate to not only do surveys about COVID-19, but also continue our customer satisfaction tracking. What we found in both instances was that most carriers were continuing some form of surveys. About half of them were continuing their tracking surveys. So we made the decision to keep our tracker out there. We also made the decision to start the new tracker, which I'll spend some time describing today. Early data sources, as I said, tracking from our customer satisfaction survey, especially open-ended questions. There were a lot of people who were flying who talked about the pandemic, even as early as March and February. We also looked at a lot of third-party surveys, US population studies, global studies, and of course, travel studies. Very few travel studies, by the way. The IATA one has been incredibly helpful, so really appreciate the work that David and his team have done with IATA. But in terms of other kinds of travel studies, like travel agency studies, we really didn't have a lot to go on. There were some strengths and weaknesses of these types of data sources. The first and most obvious is when you're looking at US population studies, they're not very useful in terms of traveler audiences. Our travel audience, at least at American, is quite unique versus the US population. And so it's interesting to look at US population studies because obviously our travelers are living amongst those people, but the US population does not necessarily represent the flyer, and especially doesn't really represent the frequent flyer. Secondly, we noted some sampling issues for many of the travel studies, particularly those that employ panels. And so we were a little cautious about panel data, which I think can be useful, but we really prefer to have data from customers who were not on panels or not being paid to do surveys, if you will. And just one comment here. One of the things we like about the Airsat survey that IATA does is it's not a panel study. They actually survey real customers who are either in planning or deplaning on their trips. And then finally, we needed more specific questions on what actions were seen as most important to our customers in keeping them safe from COVID-19. And what they were most concerned about. Some of these other studies were more general, and so they asked questions about restaurants and other types of societal issues, not so much about the travel experience specifically. So we needed to get much more specific about what's going on. And as a result of that, we started many months ago a weekly COVID tracking survey. And we are in week 11 right now. And basically what we did is we surveyed 10,000 of our Advantage members. Advantage is our loyalty program. And our focus was actually on the more frequent flyers and our elites. We did speak to non-elites in these surveys, but our focus was really on those who fly 2 or 3 or more times a year. The modal number of flights for those doing the survey was about 10 flights per year. Why would we talk to such frequent flyers? We had a dual purpose here. One was these were our most valuable customers, number one, and number two, these are our most informed customers. So if we're going to make changes and implement initiatives, we felt like we needed to get the buy-in or at least an understanding from our most valued customers. And we thought that if we made these changes for those customers, it would then apply to those who fly much less frequently. That being said, we did have enough sample in our study, and we had about a 10% response rate to gain insights from those who travel much less frequently, such as those who fly just once or maybe twice a year. The survey was very extensive. We covered concern levels. We asked what their main areas of concern were, and I'll tell you the main area of concern was not health. It was actually the economy. The small businesses and the global economy were the number one and number two issues. We asked about the emotional impact of the crisis, in other words, how people feel. We asked when it was going to be over, and found very similar results to what David described with the study that he did. We also asked about signs that the crisis will abate. The quick answer is the vaccine. Okay, over 55% of our customers say when a vaccine comes, that's when it's over. What important measures we can take? Talked about corporate travel restrictions, willingness to engage in certain travel activities, and you see the rest of the list up there. We did ask briefly about press coverage. We dropped that question because there was so much cynicism among our flyers with regard to the press. Most of them actually were getting their COVID-19 information from health sites like the World Health Organization, or in the United States, the CDC, or NIH. Those are our health institutions. And so we learned early on that press coverage, most people, our customers at least, were not paying a lot of attention to the network news or social media. They were paying close attention to local news sources, such as their local newspaper, their local television stations. But for the most part, they were looking at actual data with respect to COVID-19, which was interesting, by the way. And then we asked questions about how we were perceived versus others in handling the crisis, and then traveling less, traveling more in the future, and then a lot of open-ended questions. Last but not least, and if you're doing COVID tracking with your organization, I would really encourage you to do this. We had a special section at the end of the survey. So what you see in those bullets above are sort of the fixed questions that we asked. But every week we have a special section that asks questions about things that a department at American is concerned about, something they want us to go test, etc. And I'll give you an easy example. About a month ago, we got a question from our onboard and product department with respect to sort of a PPE kit that could be delivered at the gate or on board the aircraft. And they asked us to cover about 5 or 6 questions just to get some details around what people wanted in the kit, where they wanted that delivered, etc. We've also asked questions about food and beverage. I know somebody asked a question already on that because we limited our food and beverage offerings, so our catering department was curious as to how people were feeling about that move. So the weekly special questions was an incredibly important part of the survey, continues to be. We have special questions on the survey this week, for instance, with regard to our lounges. And next week, we will have even more special questions. So that's kind of the survey in a nutshell and a brief summary of what it was about. Sorry. Just quickly, some points on the survey itself. The usage and release of the study is weekly. We usually close the survey on Friday. We send results to our executives on Sunday afternoon, in other words, 2 days later. So survey launches on Tuesday, and basically 5.5 days later, our leaders have fresh data in their inbox. And if you're wondering, well, what level of folks do we send this to in our company, it's director and above. So roughly about 600 people would get our email with the report for the prior week, with all of the prior weeks before that. And then we encourage them strongly to share the study with their teams. So we ask them to cascade downward, and as appropriate, share it with their partners, particularly those who are in the airports. That's the second bullet. I'm a big believer in data democracy. That is information, insights, particularly those about our customers, are good and useful. And with a crisis like this that is global and shared, we had a philosophy that the data should be democratically shared, and that we shouldn't be hiding anything, and that we should be open and honest with people in sharing that. To that point, we spent a lot of time sharing this data and continue to share this data with our partners, our travel agency community, the airport authorities. We have done several webinars with many dozens of airports around the country and around the world, describing the results we've obtained. And except for a few proprietary questions, have been very open with them about what we're learning. We also share with certain teams on a targeted basis, and tying into all of that, we created a separate study that we worked on with some of our analytics departments. We call it the Who's Traveling study. This is a study that is based on actual data of people flying. So it includes demographic data, industry types, and also frequent flyer status and past patterns. So when I would send out my survey report every week, we would also send out this Who's Traveling study. Just so you know, and again, in the spirit of data democracy, who is traveling, we discovered very early on that lots more younger people were flying than before, especially those under the age of 30. So a pretty heavy millennial audience. And secondly, we learned that some of the industries who continued flying were in the energy sector, some of the insurance sector, but in the consulting sector, they almost completely vanished. In terms of frequent flyer status, we noticed that elites were not flying nearly as much, obviously. Corporate travelers were almost non-existent, and the business flyer was basically grounded. So the Who's Traveler study was a very useful thing. And then last but not least, we conducted a huge conjoint study. Those of you who are familiar with survey research know that conjoint is a way of sort of doing scenario analysis and trying to understand the importance of up to, I think we tested 22 different COVID-related actions individually and then as bundles. So is deep cleaning of hard surfaces, fogging the aircraft, wearing masks, testing customers, taking temperatures, all of those things were put into the conjoint study. We surveyed over 7,000 people, both our customers, those who fly other carriers, and got a lot of useful insights from that study, mainly for those of our folks in the company who who deal with such safety measures. All right, let me share with you a few key insights, and I'll try not to be repetitive of some of the things David said. As a survey researcher, it's always good to see that survey results look similar across different surveys, and I think this is no exception. First of all, level of concern. You'll see in week 1, which was early April, high concern or extreme concern was incredibly high at 59%. That has actually dropped off, but you will notice if you look at these trends in recent weeks, that it has leveled off at about an 80%, 75 to 80% level. This week, in fact, it's up a little bit. So one thing that we have really made note of in terms of concern regarding COVID-19 is that concern, though dropping to some degree, still remains very, very high. These are levels of concern that I have never seen before. In fact, I mentioned 9/11. After 9/11, about a month or two later, I did not see levels of concern this high. With COVID-19, this is something that definitely scares people and concerns them, and is something they're worried about. And again, these are our flyers answering this question. And though 41 plus 35% is a lower number than what we were seeing in the first weeks, it's still a very, very high number relative to what should normally be happening. All right, next. I told you that we asked about how people feel. And what we did is we created a slider scale for people to tell us whether they were, for instance, upset or calm, whether they were peaceful or scared, insecure or safe. Green is better, red is not. And what you quickly understand from this slide is that people are definitely concerned and feeling vulnerable and to some degree uneasy. But in terms of being calm and peaceful and safe, they're feeling fine. In other words, our conclusion from this, and this has been true from the very early weeks, was that the keep calm, carry on philosophy is being employed by our customers. That being said, they definitely feel vulnerable. And as David indicated, our survey also clearly indicated that the vulnerability had to do with the fear of infection and the concern of a person-to-person contracting of the COVID-19 disease. I've got a few trending charts here to the right. I'm showing you these just to share with you that in terms of week-to-week trends, so week 1 is on the far left, week 10 is on the far right. We have not seen a lot of change in terms of these characteristics. This is important because in a survey world, you do look for trends and changes, and the COVID-19 pandemic we're definitely still in the midst of it based on what I'm seeing here. All right, we ask lots of questions about when it will end. This is an interesting chart because if you look on the far right, in week 1, 1/3 of our customers thought it would be over in about 3 months, and about 1/3 thought it would be done in 6 months. Fast forward to last week, only 12% said it would be over in 3 months, and only 19% thought it would be over in 6 months. Many, many more thought it would be done within a year or more. So what has shifted is I tie this to information. As people have learned more about COVID-19 and learned more about how it spreads and how to prevent it, I think they have become, frankly, more realistic about how long the crisis is going to last. And so as with the IATA study you saw just a minute ago, we are definitely seeing that our customers think this is a long haul struggle that they're going to be looking at. Next, if I can get it to go to the next slide. There we go. We ask, as I said, many action items. What could we do to help you feel safe? During this outbreak, what sort of measures do we need to take? I want you to notice something very, very quickly from this chart. I've given you the top 2 box scores to the right hand. What you'll notice very quickly is none of these rate low. And to David's point, we have learned from the beginning that almost anything you ask people about in terms of preventing COVID-19 spread, they view as important. And so we had to be sort of careful in asking this question. And specifically, you'll notice this dark blue. That's actually a rating of very important. And this lighter blue is just a rating of important. And so we initially asked people about effectiveness in the survey. We dropped that very quickly because we discovered everything was seen as effective. And so we changed the question to what is important. And as you see here, the most important thing that our customers thought we could do was to disinfect high contact surfaces on the plane prior to boarding, and specifically doing it between every flight. What's interesting for those of you who work in the airport environment, the second and third highest graded items have to do with the airport itself. In airport transportation, things like people movers, buses at the airport, and then stringent cleaning practices for the concessions and restaurants at the airports. We specifically added these questions for our airport partners because they wanted to know how our customers were feeling about the areas that they had control of versus those that we had control of. The fourth biggest thing is restricting access to seats. This is a social distancing question. Masks and gloves, hand sanitizer, you can see on down the list. Fogging, interestingly, was seen as very important. And then at the very bottom, still a very high score of 71% temperature screening. I will tell you, in terms of temperature screening, this was a polarizing question. We had some customers who absolutely loved the idea and some who did not like it at all, particularly those who had privacy concerns. Let me share with you a couple of other quick things. We initially asked about HEPA filters in the survey. We stopped asking because it was, it's something that all of us do. We have HEPA filters on board all of our mainline aircraft that screen out about 99.9% of particulates. We took it out because its importance was in the 98 to 99% range, and it wasn't changing. So given that it was something we were already doing and something that we did not want to change, we didn't think there was as much value. But HEPA filters are definitely something that we knew to share with our customers. So I share all of this with you to tell you that when we communicate with our customers, send them emails or post things on social media like Facebook or LinkedIn, we try to go through the 5 or 6 top measures that you see there. So if you see any of our executives talk or things that we share in bullet form, we're going to talk about disinfecting high contact surfaces and some of the other measures you see on the screen. Next, as I mentioned, we asked questions in the first few weeks about what people were most concerned about with regard to COVID-19. This was a surprising question because we thought it was going to be health, and it was not. I understand U.S. population, obviously very concerned about health. For our customers, at least, their personal health, their personal financial well-being were not major concerns. Instead, they were much more concerned about small businesses and the financial well-being of those institutions and also the economy. What do we do with this information? Well, that told us that at least for our customers, COVID-19 was seen as an economic crisis as well as a healthcare crisis. The other thing that was interesting is our customers had a greater concern for the health of their family members versus their own personal health. We interpreted that based on some other data that we had to mean that when they fly, they were concerned about infecting other members of their family. And to the point that was made earlier, they also know people who have been infected with the virus. And so interesting that they had a deep concern, at least for the health of their family members and those that they know. So interesting phenomenon there. Then we asked the question, or continue to ask the question about what people are comfortable doing. If the threat dissipates or it's no longer seen as a serious threat, do you feel comfortable already? Or is it something that's going to take a few more weeks? And let me be clear, on the green bar here, I already feel comfortable. We interpret this to mean that regardless of whether the coronavirus is no longer a threat, they're ready to fly or they're ready to do these things right now, okay? So one of the measures we look at is this one, probably the most important, and that is returning to the office. We've been tracking this very, very carefully because we believe that as people are allowed to return to their offices, there will be more reason for business flyers to go visit their clients, and corporations will start to lift their travel restrictions. So we saw returning to work as a leading indicator. Hotel is also a leading indicator for us. Willing to stay in hotels, a leading indicator specifically of taking flights. Domestic and international. You will notice that the domestic flight number is at almost 1/3 today. I can tell you about 6 weeks ago, that number was about 5%. So we have seen it growing about 2 to 3% per week. International flying has not grown by a similar amount. Public transit still remains low, and cruise remains very, very low. We have a similar question to this that we ask about other things like social gatherings, restaurants, etc. And we do continue to see sort of general growth patterns. We asked this question, which of these items do you see as the best indication of the coronavirus subsiding? The vaccine being readily available is is what people said would be the sign. Interestingly, if you look at week 3, it was only at 1/3, and now it's at 47%. I took a peek at this week's survey, it's at 54%. So any news that you hear on vaccine, if you're in the travel industry, if it's good news, it's going to be good news for us. These other things that you see about flattening curves, complete testing, health organizations giving the all clear, those are important, but not nearly as important as the vaccine, at least in the minds of our customers. All right. The top reasons people will travel less after the all clear. I thought I would share a few of these with you, as I think they're pretty important. First of all, we are seeing a trend of people being much more willing to do virtual meetings. One of the things COVID-19 has taught people to do is to get used to WebEx and Zoom and other conferencing techniques. And so after 9/11, we expected many more people to do virtual meeting. That didn't happen. We do expect that to happen to some degree with this pandemic. That is, if you look at a year from now, one of our expectations is that there will be a much more willingness among customers to meet virtually as opposed to hopping on a plane and seeing people face to face. Secondly, the fear of getting sick. Being honest with you, it makes people hesitant to fly. You'll see the quotes from folks below that. And then third, mostly travel for business and the employer has to do with cutting travel expenses and travel bans that are in place. And then finally, though my employer has allowed me to travel, my clients are simply not allowing visitors. So those are at least some of the top insights that we've gathered. And then let me quickly go with some key learnings. And Kasia, I see you, so I know my time is almost up. And I'll run through these very quickly. In a pandemic like this, I can tell you from an insight standpoint, all eyes are fixed on what we know about the customer. This was an incredible opportunity for us to share data to help our decision makers understand. Data democracy is critical. We worked very hard to tie our survey data to operations and financial data. We focused on the emotional state of our customers, how they're feeling and how they're processing this pandemic. What worried them most, we focused on demand and customer behaviors, in addition to how people were feeling. And we tried to keep some of our questions in the survey constant for tracking purposes, but we were also willing to drop questions if we weren't seeing a lot of change. And then last two things, we cascaded the data throughout the organization. There are literally thousands of people at American Airlines who by Monday morning have seen the survey that we released on Sunday afternoon. And then finally, open-ended questions are very powerful. It's good to show people percentages and graphs and charts, but it's much more powerful, I think, to show them what people are actually saying in their own words. That's it for me. Thank you, Kasia.
Thank you so much, William, for this presentation. Just for those of you who need to leave right now, we are recording this session and we're going to be sending you the recording of it in case you cannot stay with us longer. And right now, I would like to introduce our next presenter, Andrew Matters, IATA's Deputy Chief Economist, who's going to draw for us the macroeconomic outlook and some expectations for the next months to come. So Andrew, over to you.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Kasia. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. We're going to change gears a little bit in terms of the content of the next session, and I'm going to move reasonably quickly through our latest forecast. Some of you may have seen that. We published them last week, but I'll give you a very quick overview of where we've come out in terms of the outlook for the industry this year and for next year. Before I get to that, I want to spend a little bit of time just showing you the impact that we have seen on actual flights. And so the first chart that I've got today gives you an indication of the impact that COVID has had on activity over the past 6 months or so. And this won't come as a surprise to any of you, but the number of global flights is down around 70% compared with its level of the start of the year. So massive impact from this pandemic, this health crisis. The positive story from this chart is that we appear to have moved up from the low point. And you can see the low point there in around mid-April was where flights were down more than 80% versus the start of the year. And most of those flights that were operating were either repatriation flights or cargo flights. So we have seen some improvement. Very clearly, it's not a sharp improvement. It's not a strong recovery, but we appear to be moving in the right direction at least. So that's some consolation. If we have a look at what's happening at the regional level, the story is a bit mixed. You can see that Asia Pacific and North America are performing a little bit stronger than what we're seeing in the other regions. Each of the regions is showing a bit of an uplift, so that story is constant. What differs across the regions is the timing of the downturn and the subsequent pickup, but also some of the magnitudes. And what we're seeing for Asia Pac and North America is that the stronger relative performance, and bearing in mind it's still a very weak performance, you know, for both Asia Pac and North America, we're talking falls of 60 to 70% currently. So it's still a massive decline, but the relatively better performance has a lot to do with two of the large domestic markets in those regions, obviously China and the US, where there has been some more activity than in many countries. Across the other four regions that you see there, they were effectively shut down entirely in April. You can see those declines there that troughed out at 95% or above, below the level of the start of the year. If we take a look now at RPKs, so here we're moving away from the number of flights, we're moving into a measure of passenger volumes. You can see the latest data we have is for April, and whether you look at international flights or the domestic flights, you know, we're down more than 90% in RPK terms compared with a year ago. The main market, I guess, which is showing something different is the China domestic market, and you can see that here. But even there, obviously a big hit. So when you look at these data, and this tells us the industry was essentially shut down over April. You take this, you look at the flights data, which confirms the low point in April and a subsequent recovery in the number of flights. You look at this, we think that the recovery is gradually going to come into play from now. So April, hopefully, is as bad as it's going to get for the industry. So the question now shifts more towards, well, how do we see this recovery playing out? These are the forecasts that we released last week. And again, I'm sticking with revenue passenger kilometers here, so passenger volumes. You can see the huge decline that we're seeing this year. So we've got RPKs falling by more than 50% industry-wide for 2020 compared with 2019. So to put that another way, what we're saying is that the size of the air passenger market is going to be less than half the size it was last year. For 2021, we think we're going to get strong growth. Strong growth, often admittedly low base, but we expect to see growth of around 55% in RPKs in 2021. So we're starting to see in the second half of this year, a gradual recovery start to come through, and that continues through 2021. That forecast is based on there being no second wave of the virus outbreak, and that's a critical assumption here. You can see, of course, that even with a 55% growth rate in 2021, by the end of the year, we're still 30% smaller than where we were in 2019. So despite that strong recovery, things are still at a relatively low level. And if we think about how this recovery is going to play out, we think it's going to be a phased recovery. And essentially, we think that domestic markets will be the first to recover. So as the virus is contained within a country, some of those travel restrictions get lifted and the domestic market starts to recover. We think that'll be followed by short haul travel and then by longer haul international and intercontinental travel. So you can see that the pace of the recovery and the timing of the recovery is going to differ across domestic versus international markets and those sort of shorter haul versus longer haul markets. One of the key factors, and both David and William picked up on this, restoring traveller confidence is key to getting the industry back in the air and getting aircraft flying again and filling those seats. One of the other factors that we shouldn't ignore, of course, is the role of governments in this. And solving the health challenge is going to be critical for international travel, because until that health challenge is addressed, governments aren't going to be prepared to open their borders, to ease those travel restrictions in a wholesale kind of way. And what this leads to is some interesting developments around the idea of travel bubbles or travel corridors, where governments start to think on more a bilateral rather than a multilateral basis about opening up their borders to countries where they believe that the risk of allowing travel is reduced, because those partner countries have, in a similar way, also been able to contain the pandemic and make that environment a safer one for air travel. The interesting question then becomes, how do we start to join up some of those travel bubbles and those travel corridors in order to get that sort of global wholesale integration of international travel working? So that's going to be a key challenge going forward, and it's one of the interesting dynamics that we're facing at the moment. One of the implications of the massive fall in traffic that we've seen this year and the shutdown of the industry is we think that city pair connectivity is also going to be impacted. You can see the red dotted line here is the number of city pair connections in April of this year, and the massive unwind there. Unsurprising given the fall off that we saw in traffic. Why does this matter? Well, this matters because connectivity and air transport, it's not just about moving people and boxes from place A to place B. The air transport industry also contributes to the flows of trade and investment, and importantly for many countries, tourism as well. So the fact that we think there's going to be a considerable fall in city pair connectivity has some of these broader implications for economic activity, economic growth, and the recovery in the global economy going forward as well. One of the things that we expect to see in the recovery period, and certainly in the early stages of the recovery, is that airlines will try to stimulate demand through lower fares. And this chart shows data for both domestic fares and international fares. The solid lines are historical actual data, and the dashed lines for each of those two series are the data that's coming from bookings. And you can see that particularly for domestic fares, the data are telling us that fares are being cut to try to help to stimulate demand. The one thing to keep in mind at the moment, of course, is that in terms particularly of the international fares, there's not a lot of markets that are open. There's not a lot of routes available. So we're treating that data with a little bit more caution than what we're seeing in terms of the domestic markets. As that international travel starts to come back online, we can put a little bit more confidence, I think, in the data that we're seeing. And we would expect to see a decline in the international airfares as well as the domestic airfares to try to get people back in the air. If we move to the next slide. Next slide just shows the degree of competition in the industry, and this supports our view around the outlook for airfares being low initially. You can see on the right-hand side, 80% of seats worldwide are on routes where there are at least two airlines competing. So in a highly competitive industry, a highly competitive market, when demand is very low and capacity is much higher than demand, with all of the empty aircraft that are available. Again, this is another reason why we think that those airfares are going to come down because of the extent of competition in the market. So let me just try to sum up very quickly our current view. And on the final slide today, the blue line is the line that we showed before. We've extended this out a little bit. So we're still looking at RPKs here. We've extended this out to 2025. So you see the recovery there. What we show on this chart, and it's a little bit messy, we have a downside scenario that's there in red. So in the event that we don't get the containment as smoothly, as easily as we hope in our baseline case, and also as a consequence of that partly, you also get a slower economic recovery, which feeds through to the industry outlook as well. So I've shown that here. And we've also added here the pre-COVID forecast. So this is our December forecast. And you can see that while we do get a recovery in activity, it's a relatively modest recovery. It's not a sharp bounce back, as we often see in the industry after some kind of shock. It's a gradual recovery. It's a recovery. We're moving in the right direction, but it's going to take us time to get back to the 2019 levels of activity and then to grow from there. Cassia, that's all I have today. I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for this presentation. And we're going to move right now to our questions and answer session. As we are reviewing the last questions that you may have also for Andrew, I would like to take this time to present you one of our IATA training offerings, which is strictly focusing on the passenger insights. So we are exploring different ways of research methods, the whole idea of visualizing those data and conveying the message inside your organizations. So if you would be interested in this offering, we also in this time, usually it's in-class offering. We do it as a classroom, but today we also offer it as a digital virtual classroom training. So we encourage you to check it out. And I would like to invite you, all our speakers, to go back with their cameras on. And I'm going to use support of my colleague, Andrew Price, who is the head of Global Baggage Operations at IATA, who's going to moderate this Q&A session. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Cassia. We've overrun by quite a bit of time, so I'm going to keep these very short and just ask a couple of questions we have. All of the questions that we received are being moderated by our legal team, so any that we can answer that we don't get to today, we will have an FAQ on the website where you can see the answers. So, William, if I can come over to you to start off with, you presented a lot of passenger insights that you've collected in American Airlines throughout the last few months. To the extent that we've got public information that's available, and we're not asking you to disclose anything that's commercially sensitive, what are the specific actions that you've taken as a result of your survey results, and any of those that you can share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of quick things I'll share with you. One is the electrostatic fogging that we do on our aircraft during cleaning. This is actually something we've been doing since 2017. What we discovered was people didn't know what that was. And so from our surveys, we tested various ways of sharing with people what that meant and what it meant for cleaning. And so that shaped not only the actual fogging that we do or the cleaning that we do with the electrostatic spray, but also how we share with customers. Secondly, I described the PPE kit. This is the sort of sanitation wipes and bottled water and things like that. The survey actually guided exactly how we deployed that. Frankly, we asked about how other carriers were doing this as well. So those are a couple of examples that I'm happy to share where we not only fine-tuned things, but made it better for our customers.
Thank you, William. Then moving on, just David, a question for you here. We see that many airlines are implementing limited services, especially in the area of food and beverages. What do the data tell us about that aspect of cabin service?
Sure. We asked about how concerned are you about consuming catered items on board the aircraft? And like everything in our survey and everything in William's work, we find people are concerned about everything. But on a relative basis, catered items falls toward the lower end. You still have 59% who say they're very or somewhat concerned. 21% say they're very concerned. But nonetheless, when we then follow that up with pick your top 3 concerns, 1 out of 4 do pick consuming catered items on board as one of their top 3 concerns at roughly 24%. But to put that in perspective, that's that 24% in terms of a top 3 concern compares to 65% who are concerned about sitting next to somebody who might be infected. So yes, a concern, but not as high a concern.
That's really interesting. Thank you, David. And I don't know if you can answer this, David. It's quite legal, but there was a question about the scope of the responses that we gathered. It says here, we didn't collect any Chinese responses from Peggy Hemp, who's one of our attendees. I'm just wondering, can you talk about the scope of the survey? How wide was our net cast for that?
Sure, it's an 11-country survey. We did not have China in the survey. It doesn't mean, in potential future waves that one could not add that in, but as really, and this might be more of a question for Kasia in terms of, because we're taking sort of direction from IATA, what countries would you like to include? But it's certainly possible to include China in the future. We have done traveler surveys for IATA that do include China, so it's certainly a doable thing. But in this particular project, it was not included as a country. The closest, just in Asia, and obviously they're very different countries, but would be Japan and Singapore.
Thank you, David. Thank you. So we are quite a lot over our time limit. So Cassia, if I can hand it back to you. As I said, where the questions that we haven't had a chance to answer, we will type up a response in an FAQ that we'll make available at the same place as the recording.
Yes. Thank you so much, Andrew, for this. Yeah, so we ran out of time, but I think it was a very good time for all of you to listen to the passenger insights that we've collected, to different examples that American Airlines included in their program, and also to have a look at the macro level, because this also puts the whole passenger insights into perspective. With this webinar, what we wanted to do is to highlight how important it is to track passenger insights, especially during these times, because this is the passengers who are going to come back to flying or not. When will they do it, etc. So we need to understand what will make them feel safer. What can we do to basically bring them back on board? That's why the whole power of the customer insights is always important, but today even much more important than ever. So thank you so much to our wonderful speakers for today. Thank you for preparing very interesting insights for the whole audience, and thanks to you for spending this morning, afternoon, or even late evening for some of you. Thank you so much for joining, and most of all, stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.